many thanks to everybody. I'll keep them non-Hollywood length, but really heartfelt thanks to Jana, to Andrei and Naira, who are the sort of three that I've dealt with most closely, to everybody else involved in organising, and also to Simon for his very generous introduction. And I just also want to say a couple of things, one of which is that I actually am now working on a project which is on historical film in the former USSR, which actually does cover areas which are not Russian. So I have worked in the Armenian archives, for example, in the archives in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all three Baltic republics and Moldova, as well as Ukraine and Russia. So Ukraine not in the recent past. And when I looked at the conference program, I realized that my original specification for what I was going to say would probably be of very limited interest to most people. So I've rejinked what I'm saying, and this is more of a conceptualizing talk. Rather sort of, first thoughts about how to formalize an enormous amount of very diverse material and not repeat myself when I have written already about spaces. And I wrote a rather general thing in an afterword to a book edited by Marcus Koller and Paul Betts, which is about spatiality in Eastern Europe, including but not limited to Russia. And I'm starting on my front cover with an image from the National Museum of Fine Arts in Bishkek. And Bishkek remains a particularly pure example of Soviet urban design. Very little has changed, actually, and it's interesting when it comes up. I mean, I wouldn't dream of raising this directly. It would be grossly rude and tactless. But if you mention something, they say, oh, we don't really think about the Soviet past. We haven't kind of analysed the Soviet past very much. And this incorporates, I mean, you can see a sort of a classic sort of commemorative space, if you like, which incorporates a rather beautiful mosaic. And it is in a late Soviet building, a high standard late Soviet building. So just an example of that with which to begin, but I shan't be talking purely about urban spaces here. I shall just move on, I hope. Oops, is that going to move on? I can use the arrows on this if nothing else. Right. So these are just, the areas where I've worked myself, and very briefly in Children's World, I looked at, for example, the spaces in which children played, and I think they're backing up. The spaces in which children played, the school as a space, as well as a social institution, and particularly also not just an ideological institution, an institution of conditioning children, nurseries. Also, I planned originally to have an entire section called The Landscape of Childhood, but the publishers had the vapors when I brought in this vast manuscript, and they just told me it had to be cut, so I took out that quarter of the book, but anyway, I did the research on that. St. Petersburg is about city spaces in a very obvious way. I mean, partly as repositories of memory, partly as city identity, and partly as a question of the intersection between the two. And then Socialist Churches was about the idea of sacred space and how, very crudely put, one form of sacred space, religious, becomes the second form of sacred space, which is the historical, heritage-related space in this particular city. And then finally, Soviet Art House is a rare example of a study of cinema which is actually based in the studio and is rooted in production history. So there I was talking about the space of Lenfilm as somewhere where films are made. I'll come back a bit to the sort of spaces of film later, but it was, for example, about the competition for people to get a particular sound stage, to make films in particular places. There was always a shortage of space, about how to put together resources to make films of expeditie, so to make them outside on location shoots, and particularly if they were abroad. And I mean, also all kinds of other points about the way that the costume and design workshop functioned, the film processing workshop, which was always a nexus of illegal drinking, and so on. So that kind of is an overview. And as I say, I've tried to sort of work towards some conceptual questions here. And I mean, I emphasize that this is very much an initial phase, and please ask lots of questions and challenge it, because that's exactly what it's been set up for. It's not presenting something which I would be deeply offended if anybody took issue with, very much the other way around. So, yes, questions of classification, I've called this. And I've taken Simon Franklin, as a tribute to Simon Franklin, taken his concept of graphosphere, about which he's written a brilliant book, and used to sort of that to stretch the idea of various spheres, ways in which connected realms of space can work, and the ways in which they may interconnect. And the reason that the arrows are all over the place is because I do not want to suggest some kind of hierarchy or chronological, temporal or whatever else sequence between them. So I wouldn't want to suggest that the physiosphere necessarily precedes anything else, because I'm talking about this at a stage when human actors are already present, and that's not at all to make them primary. One of the things I hope to do is to show how space drives behaviour rather than, or as well as the other way around. So physiosphere, these are all based on the same Greek origins as graphosphere, so that would be the extraterrestrial as well as the geological and corporeal. And actually when I was working on the afterword for the Betts and Collar book, I realised that the discourse on space as a cultural phenomenon, so the sort of theory on that, comes into being just at the time when space exploration is really getting underway. And I do think that actually the cosmos is part of the background to the evolution of this intense interest with space, space in a very different sense. But anyway, geological, I also would have classified corporeal space here, so the interior spaces of the body, so head space, abdominal space, of which we become increasingly aware as we get older. Not wanting to sort of go off into a digression about that, but it's unfortunately one of those things. I've said the katagiosphere, so from the Greek word for shelter, so that would be inner spaces and the functions they can have. And two concepts there which might be of use are the sort of German historian Günter Gauss's article on niche society. I've got a kind of list of further reading at the end if people are interested. And so that's the idea of these sort of social informal spaces. And then Finn Sivert Nielsen, the Norwegian anthropologist's study of St. Petersburg, or as it then was, Leningrad, so this 1986, brilliant and slightly crazy study, just the sort of book that I like, which uses the concept of a centre, which is kind of not a centre, it dissipates. So lithosphere, which is the architectural and monumental, so from the idea of stone underlying it, so obviously stone is not always there. And cartosphere, which is classificatory, so the map-making side of space, the delineatory side of space. And then fantasiosphere, or representational, recollectional, and imaginatory, which is a rather pretentious neologism. And these aren't at all intended to be exhaustive, but just to suggest some areas which may interconnect and where one study can fruitfully engage with another study, and that could be across these classifications as well. Another set of, I think I have to go backwards to go forwards in this particular thing. So the role of agency, as I've already mentioned, how this is balanced between animate and inanimate forces, not suggesting human and non-human, merely, so construction, reconstruction, redesignation, revitalization, and the impact of space, facilitation, inhibition, and automatization of responses. So as in Michal Jampolsky's work, for example, about how people cease to notice statues, for example, or major public buildings after a certain amount of contact with them. And the building, by the way, is the Bishkek Central Post Office, which looks exactly like Central Post Office used to do in the Soviet period in every way. And it doesn't bear a single advertising sign, still has these steps, and it still very much has a central place, despite the post no longer in real terms having such a space, having such a place in the hierarchy. I do want to raise the question of what is specific about socialist space, so just moving on to that. And so speaking very crudely, a lot of the work related to the former USSR and to other parts of the former socialist world tend to go towards the Foucault direction, as also manifested in the anthropologist Paul Rabinov's work on the architecture of power, so the creation of urban spaces that themselves intimidate, direct, generate particular buildings, behaviour and uses for particular buildings and spaces. And in this idea, space didn't emerge, as the phrase used by Lefebvre is. It was planned. It was debated. It was criticised in many respects also, and there was an extensive engagement or involvement of state agents in the centre of discussion and in planning. And I can agree that in many ways this seems a preferable and more suitable way of addressing the issue of socialist space than the Lefebvre definition of social space, especially urban space, emerging in all of its diversity, and this image of flaky millefeuille pastry. Unfortunately, in colloquial British English, flaky has the additional meaning of being slightly all over the place and unrigorous. But I do actually want to concentrate on the sort of less unexpected, the less planned uses of space here, partly because I think it's in tune with what a lot of people are doing at the conference anyway, and also partly because I've tended to work in that direction. I think it can produce results which are interesting, a sort of counterintuitive use of state approach to state spaces. Of course, there's also public versus private spheres, the very famous debate on that. This goes back a very long way in where it relates particularly to private space when it comes to Soviet history and Russian history. Yekaterina Pravilova, who's sitting here, has done a brilliant book about public space, which is a much less kind of widely discussed phenomenon. I'm going to say less about that, but trying to have a non-binary definition, which according to these categories. And what I've picked out for a bit of further discussion, without wanting to sort of take us far too far and far too long, I want to say a bit about cartiosphere, lithosphere and fantasiosphere, partly to accommodate my own research interests, and partly also to take me into areas where I've had to do a bit of extra work and have actually had to sort of read new things so that I don't simply, as I say, repeat what I've done. So first of all, moving on to cartiosphere, and one example of mapping which has very direct consequences, and I know that people in the room are all too tragically aware of this, is the whole issue of state borders. And a brief history is that, of course, passports exist well before 1917, and they exist in the wider world as well. But it's interesting that in Baedeker's 1914 guidebook, which is an immensely detailed and conscientious guide for travellers, the only two countries that are mentioned which I expect passports to be obtained are the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. So those are the two exceptions, and I have to say this is for a Western European readership. So this is a German guidebook translated into English. So what I'm not saying is that there's a wonderful place in the world which has got free borders. It's called the free world. Everyone can get there, which is patently absurd. I mean, everybody who knows about recent British politics knows about the small boat outrage and the way that this is really a political issue which is just dominating in an absolutely appalling way a large amount of discussion, everything from local chats, which you just wouldn't believe some of the stuff that you see on there, up to the level of political reshuffles and people flancing out and worrying about the next election, and obviously European populism in what we used to call the continent is also deeply imbued with this as well. But it's just that is to emphasise the historicity of this phenomenon. That, I mean, passports haven't been there since time began, obviously, but there's a very specific moment when they kind of become more widespread, and that's the First World War and its aftermath. And 1914 is the last time, really, when you could write a piece of guidance like this. And there you have an example of actually a passport from the Russian Empire, which was easier to find than an image of a passport from a traveller to Russia. Moving on again. So the Soviet border, I mean, the thing that makes the Soviet border different is the extremely elaborate lithosphere function of that particular space, so that it is itself denominated. So after the revolution, the process of creating state borders of the USSR precisely, and I mean here I show my background as mainly working on that. So the process of creating the USSR goes in step with the creation of international boundaries. So the 14th of July 1921 OGPU decree on the defense of the borders of the USSR established a border force and the creation of border defences, and that's reiterated in the CEC, so the Central Executive Committee decree of 1923. So it specifically creates the strips, so the pograniczne policy of 4 meters up to 22 kilometers at that stage. So the idea that the border is not just the border, but it's also the surrounding territory. And it decreed that border crossings could take place legally, exclusively at manned inspection points, which is also important. There are still people, again, to judge by social websites, who think that Russian citizens can cross the border wherever they like, which is spectacularly naive. It's never been like that. Citizenship does not mean that you can legally enter the country without coming through a border point. And from 1922, you require permission from the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs to leave the country. There's a foreign passport so introduced in 1925. In 1935, defection is added to the category treachery to the motherland and becomes a capital crime. So Eric Scott has got a very detailed discussion of borders, a sort of very good and useful recent book. So they are a lithosphere. It's supplied with hardware, gates, fences, watchtowers, armed guards, tank defences. The Estonian National Museum exhibits includes tank defences, which are presumably there on the beach to stop incursions from that angle. And then there's also the question of internal borders, which are, as you see here, are not really denominated to anything like the same extent. And again, this is not inevitable. There's an article by David Gorman, Wider and Wider Still, Racial Politics, Intra-Imperial Immigration and the Absence of Imperial Citizenship in the British Empire, which makes the point that the most serious consequence, I quote, of intra-imperial confusion and discrepancy regarding immigration in the eyes of the imperial government in London, as well as many colonial subjects, was the fact that it rendered intra-imperial immigration problematic. Of course, after 1932, and indeed before that, in many ways that's true of the USSR as well, but it's not a kind of question of going across border posts, it's a question of checks on the internal passport in specific places, and particularly the Propiska. But anyway, you see that the sort of hardware attached to the borders is closely similar in the RSFSR and Ukrainian SSR border in 1954 and in the Scottish border these days, where they apparently play you a recording of bagpipes as you cross here and that you gather that you from the flag that you're in Scotland. There may come a time when this is consequential. As somebody of Scottish descent, I'm looking forward to the moment when I get my Scottish passport. I'd almost rather have anything than the British one right now. But anyway, there is contestation of these two things. The national borders on the one hand, the international borders on the other hand, but this tends to come up at highly specific periods. So periods of retreat of an imperial occupying power or conquest on the other. So, I mean, on the one hand, the early 1920s, it's the USSR, and the other hand, the late 1920s. Indeed, the early 1920s and late 1940s internationally, mid to late 1940s. And there isn't generally participation by the general public. This is resolved at the sort of highest level. But on the other hand, Stefan Rindlisbacher's book, Borders in Red, which came out at the end of last year, points out that there was a lot of discussion about setting up internal borders in the USSR, right down to the level of arguing about whose apple orchard was in which republic. There was a lot of petition work done, and this is a fascinating side about which I, for example, had no idea. And then there's also the sort of informal side of international borders, so illegal border crossings. This comes from the Estonian National Archive, this piece, about two Finnish fishermen who, helped probably by the bottles that they had on the boat as well as their navigational stills, but managed to run out of diesel, make landfall. So they made landfall on what they discovered was actually Soviet Estonia, and naturally had a welcome commission which consisted of border guards. That isn't a surprise. What is a surprise is that they were actually then returned without charge. So it was decreed to be an administrative offence rather than a political offence, although there were plenty of political statutes under which they could have been got if that had been necessary. So there's a description. I mean, you can see the anecdotal description. If you read Russian and you're in the right place. I'm sorry about the sightlines. It's difficult, but anyway, the substance of it is there. Actually quite a sympathetic account of how these poor fishermen got lost. They were on an ordinary fishing trip. They clearly didn't present any difficulties at all, and so they were let go. And then there are, of course, illegal transactions. So, for example, when the Estonian customs presumably found a copy of Playboy in a soldier's cabin, a sailor's cabin, excuse my misspeech, and again, it kind of goes to the KGB, both of these KGB records, and the KGB decides that really this is nothing pornographic in this magazine, which presumably ended up very well thumbed when every single member in the office had to sort of, exercise their opinion about whether that was actually the case or not. And it wasn't the issue from November 1979. It was an earlier issue, so I can't guarantee the fact that the one or two obviously non-pornographic issues articles here is completely right. But anyway, there's a sense, and again Eric Scott's dealt with this, that there's a considerable lightening of hand in the 1960s, 1970s towards exactly these cases. There's a sort of sense of more flexibility, and it has to be said also a great deal more произвол. So if I can be forgiven a personal reminiscence, when I and a group of students, so one German student, 4 Austrian students and I left through Odessa on a ferry to go to Venice, the customs at Odessa removed copies of Krokodil from one of the Austrians on the ground that this is our Soviet satire, it's not for you in the West. Although every university library of any standing with the Slavic department had a full run of Aganyok going right back to the late 1940s. There was no problem with getting that, or indeed Krokodil. Contraband and border crossing can be problems and they cannot be problems, and there's a great deal of sort of the human factor there. What I want to talk about now is urban space, because there's sort of more varied material, and I'll go through this relatively quickly because I've written about some of it as well. So the primary side that might be familiar, especially to sort of naive Western commentators, is homogenization. I mean, it has to be said that for somebody who came from the sort of chaos of London's city planning, or a great deal of British cities planning, especially after the 1960s, had put urban motorways through them and multi-storey car parks and shopping centres, that there seemed to be something which is clearly far more regimented about Soviet space. And you only then noticed, for example, in Voronezh, the city where I spent a year as a student, you only later noticed that there were wooden houses in the middle, that they weren't plumbed, there were pumps on the street, that they weren't sanitized, and there was still wooden huts outside. And in Yerevan, where we were in February 1981, we also noticed that behind the facades of these magnificent Tamanyan buildings were quite different shacks. The Blue Mosque at that stage had not been restored, and it was just tumbling down, and it was sort of shut off so you couldn't see it. And beside the, at that stage famous Dvorets Молодежи, or the sort of the youth Palace of Youth. So literally kind of 200 meters from that was a small shrine in which people had left chicken feet as a sacrifice to the icon. So there was a sense of this contestation of urban space even back then, if you had an experienced eye. The late Soviet period introduces flagship buildings of its own, and so in Yerevan it would be, for instance, the building that I've just mentioned, the Palace of Youth, the for example, also the Russia cinema, I mean, a large number of these. The Erebuni Museum, I mean, all of these are very important city spaces. Philharmonia building in Bishkek, I mean, another sort of list. The National Palace or the Organ Hall of Nikolai Soule in Chisinau, which has got a large number of very fine late Soviet buildings. Government Building number 3 in Yerevan, I haven't yet mentioned, although we're actually looking straight into it as I live here. The Transport Ministry in Tbilisi, all of those are very well-known examples. And so these are sort of city projects that create space around them. So they're not just an individual space, but they also make the space. So city creating projects, I mean, the ones here are a hotel, a fountain, and a metro station. These are all examples of buildings which one can find, but with a considerable degree of national and local initiative in them. But I also wanted to mention city creating projects, war memorials. I mean, that's very obvious, but these again vary from place to place. The thing that's perhaps most interesting, because least has been written about this, is the city creating role of major factories and объединения or units or combinati, combinations literally, but these multi-sited factories. And so on the left-hand side, you see the Kirov factory in Leningrad. The right-hand side is Uralmash in Sverdlovsk. And then you also have the chemical plant in Alavedi, well, this is actually Vanadzor in, rather than the copper mine, so Vanadzor in Armenia. And all of these are significant city districts, cities within cities, hugely important in terms of creating space. Also have extensive working, reconstruction, additions, particularly, say, computer rooms, calculation rooms, out-of-town pensionati in places like Sochi, if it's Russia, and also immensely energetic and lively local social culture. I mean, for example, reception of new workers into the plant. I mean, there's the program on the left-hand side comes from there. Dances, the book of honor of workers who've kind of achieved particular renown for their, I mean, this is not a formal Stahanovite system, but this is again sort of decided on a sort of ad hoc basis. So all of that is, I mean, is really important. I mean, the other thing I would say is anybody who's thinking of working on this already does, move fast, because these items here from the Kirov factory, as far as I know, they no longer exist. I used them in a museum in the early 2010s. And when I tried to clear rights in my book on St. Petersburg, I was told that they were no longer in the possession of the Kirov factory, which basically means they have thrown everything out. And I'm afraid that just does happen. I mean, this is just not seen as a worthy subject for taking up space. I mean, there are, I mean, you know, of what use is the Soviet material? You want a sort of Kira narrative about how the factory is essentially progressing into the Soviet period, from the Soviet period into the post-Soviet period. I now want to move on to the fantasiosphere and talking particularly about the cinema, and first of all as cinema as art house, so sound design and editing, for example. So this is from an album in Lenfilm in the archive there, which I'm glad to say does still exist. I mean, the archive there is still going and it is still possible to view this material. And so this is an example. They were very proud at the stage when the album was created of their new materials and their new machinery. It's a little bit later when everybody starts wanting an Arriflex, and the entire Soviet film industry is driven by Kodak, you know, prestige-related desire to have Western machines and the wherewithal for making a film. But this is a bit earlier. This is the 1960s. They think they can do it. In many cases, rightly, there's a lot of capacity at that stage, and it's commemorated in photographs. But as well as the studio itself, there's also the case of sets. So this is from an on-set image of the making of Viktor Sokolov's friends and years, so a sort of a chronology of the history of a various group of friends. And I don't know how well you can see, but actually close to on the photograph, it's obvious that the backdrop is a photograph. And this is not actually Moscow. This is what was done in the so-called, we call it post-production in English, but it was called цех комбинированных съемок in the Russian tradition. And actually, Russian is used, I don't want to sound as though I'm being imperialist, but Russian is used throughout the film industry, really wherever you are, for the sort of technical side and negotiating with the centre. So that materiality of film is also materiality of the way that it's filmed in terms of the actual material objects. This also applies to on location. Here I do have an image from Armenian cinema. So this is Bagrat Hovhannisyan, so a really important film director, and this is what I think is his best film, so Autumn Sun, which is about a woman in a peasant household in North Armenia who's just had enough of being a woman in a patriarchal household, and she spends the entire film sounding off about it and fighting it, and it's a wonderful performance by the central actress. But here I just also want to show the sort of the factura or the facture of the filming of something on location. So you have heavy cameras which need to be taken around. It's in the physiosphere, which you may or may not reshape. So sometimes literally holes are dug. Trees are transformed, taken from one place to the other. The physical environment is, of course, also transformed, so they literally build things that weren't there, they adapt things, they pull down bits, as always in film location. But here we can also see objects lying around, the significance of which is not quite clear, and film sets are definitely like that. They're chaotic places. Location is particularly a chaotic place. There's a lot of drinking there. There's a lot of what tends to happen after drinking, which is znakomstvo, kind of getting to know people better in one very specific sense, and so on. Very briefly about cinema, the visions of cinema. So Visions of a New Land is the title of a book by Emma Widdis, also at Cambridge, which is brilliantly sort of represents and discusses the function of landscape in Stalin era cinema, but this continues into the post-Soviet period. This is actually a still, or rather an image from a film called The Sky of Our Childhood by Tolomush Akiev, who's a Kyrgyz film director, part of the so-called Kyrgyz Wonder or Kyrgyz Miracle, a film that was very widely watched. It was watched right across the USSR, admired across the USSR, and has an image of the traditional past which is juxtaposed to one of the Soviet present, and both of them filmed on location. If you haven't seen the film, I do warmly recommend it. It's absolutely wonderful. I think I've come more or less to the last film slide, which is not summative. Now I've got two or three more which are just on representation of spaces. So first of all, the border, and the border is the sort of site of many heroic narratives about border guards defending the motherland and seeing off saboteurs, but it was also the subject of comedy. So Noam Bierman's I Serve on the Border is actually a comedy about the Soviet-Finnish border. And what I love about it is it's got a scene which is a parody of all those endless scenes in spy movies where a spy is exchanged for another spy, because in this film, the spy that's exchanged is actually a sheep on one side, so a Russian sheep or Soviet sheep has got the wrong side of the border, and on the other hand, so has a drunken Finnish hippie, possibly stoned as well. He's clearly not exactly on top of the world and in command of the situation. Other films are just using workspace, and these are also wonderful research material if you are interested in the spatiality of particular sites in the Soviet context, because they aim to get it right, and it was checked repeatedly in the studio. And one hears a lot about Soviet censorship, but there's also a management of film that goes down to sort of saying, hang on, you'd never have an inkwell like that on your desk in 1952. So there's a lot of what you might call consensual community definition of what's appropriate to show in films. So at the very least, you have evidence of that in these films. So this is one of a series of production dramas that came out in the early 1970s. It was a very popular genre, and has a very interesting plot as well about an outsider who steams into a factory, wants everything done kind of post-Kosygin, according to sort of, economic efficiency, makes himself rapidly incredibly unpopular, and a lot of needle then goes on. And then lastly of the images, imagining the film factory, which is The Voice, which is about making a film at Lenfilm. So it's a meta-cinematic piece, and again filmed actually in places where it was. So not improving those. I mean, unlike an earlier film, which is called Little Girl, Do You Want to Star in a Movie? A children's film, which is very much a rarefied version of Lenfilm with a cafe that's nothing like it actually was. I mean, this one very much does have the spaces as they were. So finally, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. So conclusions. So I would argue that the categories which I've set forward mediate between complete abstraction, public space, for example, and the materiality, but also messiness of particular locations. I would argue that employment of these categories allows examination of how the agency and leverage of the environment, as well as that of human actors and observers and non-human actors and observers, can vary in specific contexts. And when it comes to the cinema, places of production, including cultural production, that's true also of other places of cultural production, like typographies as well as publishing houses. So not just the editorial, but the typography, the way that works also as a space of cultural production. Or places where bronzes are cast and sculptures are carved. And they have a significance through what they produce, and as well as where they are produced. So the extensive attention to discursive questions and to the declining importance of communist and socialist ideology, such as in Alexei Yurchak's work, and I feel bad saying this behind Alexei's back, I would have said it with him here and we'd have had an argument about this, but I think that there isn't a declining importance of ideology in Central Asia, for example. It continues to be very important. I think in some ways it still does in the Caucasus as well. It just depends on the particular place. In the Russian provinces, I think it's very different from Moscow and Leningrad. People are more cynical. So we can usefully complement this by study of how the material and spatial legacy of the Soviet years has and has not survived over the last few decades. And again, that does vary a great deal. And just to finish with the last slide, I mean, just some of these, I mean, probably one to photograph, so further reading some of the things that I've mentioned in passing and some that I didn't mention in passing. So I'll leave that up for people who might want to catch that. And with that, I've come to an end. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for filling the space. And please do ask questions. As I say, I am absolutely willing to hear any criticism of this and might well share it also. Thank you for your attention.